Sophie Lane had imagined America as a fresh start, a place where she could finally carve out a life on her own terms. But standing in front of the Sterling family's grand townhouse, she felt like an intruder in a world that wasn't meant for her. The imposing brownstone, the polished brass knocker, the silent air of privilege, it all felt worlds away from the noisy apartment she had shared with her sisters back home. She was 28, unmarried, and desperate to prove that she could thrive. This nanny job wasn't just a paycheck, it was a ticket to survival. Inside, the house was eerily silent. Despite being filled with life, Olivia Sterling, the matriarch, was a vision of polished perfection. Breezing through the house in designer heels, her voice clipped and efficient, her presence fleeting, the children, Alette and Emma, were well-mannered but distant, accustomed to a mother who was more concept than caretaker. And then there was Ethan Cole, the man of the house. Handsome, charming, yet strangely detached. Sophie noticed the way his eyes lingered on her just a second too long. She ignored it, she had to, but deep down, an unsettling restlessness began to stir. The first time Sophie felt it, really felt it, was on a quiet Wednesday afternoon. The children were upstairs napping, the house momentarily still. She stood by the kitchen counter, absently flipping through one of Olivia's perfectly curated recipe books, when she sensed it, that unshakable feeling of being watched. Slowly, she turned. Ethan Cole stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame, his gaze steady, unreadable. Something about him always carried a quiet intensity, like he was constantly restraining a part of himself from being fully seen. His sleeves were rolled up, the sharp cut of his jaw shadowed by the afternoon light. "You don't have to cook for them every night," he said suddenly, his voice low, deliberate. "You work hard enough." Sophie swallowed, her fingers tightening around the book. "It's my job." He tilted his head slightly, his eyes scanning her face as if searching for something hidden beneath her calm exterior. "That doesn't mean you should always be the one taking care of everyone else." The air between them shifted, thickened. Sophie forced a polite smile. But inside, something uneasy curled in her stomach. She knew that look, the beginning of a line being drawn, and dangerously close to being crossed. It happened in the simplest of moments, a casual conversation stretching too long. A joke lingering in the air just a second too much. At first, Sophie convinced herself it was nothing. Ethan was just kind, attentive in a way most husbands were supposed to be but often weren't. But then, there were the glances that lasted a beat too long. The way his voice softened when he said her name, as if she were something delicate, something rare. One evening, as she was tucking Alette into bed, she heard Ethan's voice behind her. Low, quiet, close. "You're good with them." Sophie turned, startled. He stood in the dim light of the hallway, his presence filling the space. "I love them," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know," he said, stepping forward, his gaze unwavering. "That's what makes you different." Her pulse skipped, stuttered. She should have corrected him, should have reminded him that she was just the nanny. Instead, she held his stare, feeling the weight of something unspoken, something neither of them had put into words yet. The moment passed, but the damage was done. A door had been left open, and neither of them could pretend they didn't see it. The rain drummed against the windows, heavy and relentless, mirroring the chaos swirling inside Sophie. The children were fast asleep, their soft breathing a comforting rhythm in the silent house. She had just finished cleaning the kitchen when she sensed him before she saw him, Ethan, leaning against the doorway, watching her. "You don't have to do all this," he murmured, stepping closer. Sophie exhaled, gripping the dish towel like a lifeline. "It's part of the job." He chuckled, shaking his head. "No, it's not. You do more than what's expected." His voice dipped lower, almost hesitant, "more than Olivia ever does." She stiffened, guilt crawling up her spine. "Ethan, don't." "Don't what?" He was closer now, the scent of his cologne mixing with the faint aroma of dish soap. His eyes searched hers, filled with something she didn't want to name. "Pretend we don't both feel it?" The air thickened between them, charged and dangerous. Sophie's breath caught as thunder rumbled outside. A warning. A reckoning. She could have walked away. She should have. Instead, she stood there, trapped between what was right and what she wanted, between the storm outside and the one raging inside her. It started with a touch, so small, so fleeting. It could have been an accident. But it wasn't. Sophie had been reaching for a glass on the highest shelf, standing on her toes when she felt Ethan behind her, his presence a whisper against her back. Without a word, his hand covered hers, steadying her, his fingers grazing her skin with deliberate slowness. A spark, a shift, a moment that could never be undone. She turned, her breath unsteady, and found herself dangerously close. The kitchen light flickered above them, casting shadows that danced along his sharp jawline. His lips slightly parted as if caught between hesitation and resolve. "Sophie," he murmured, her name a confession, a plea. She should have stepped back, created space, but her body betrayed her. It leaned, like the ocean leans toward the shore, inevitable, unstoppable. His hand slid to her waist, fingers pressing lightly as if memorizing the shape of her. She knew this was the moment, the point of no return. Yet when his lips brushed against hers, she let herself fall, not just into him, but into the unraveling of everything she once thought she could control. The days after that kiss felt like walking a tightrope stretched thin between desire and destruction. Sophie told herself it had been a mistake, a lapse in judgment, but the way Ethan looked at her told another story. His gaze lingered longer, his presence heavier, as if every moment alone was a temptation neither of them could resist. One evening, as she tucked Alette and Emma into bed, she felt it again, that unspoken pull, the kind that made her pulse hammer and her breath hitch. When she turned, Ethan was there, standing in the dimly lit hallway, his arms crossed over his chest. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low, edged with something dangerous. She followed him to the kitchen, the air thick with unspoken words. He leaned against the counter, jaw tight. "Tell me to stop, Sophie," he said. "Tell me this is wrong, and I'll walk away." But she couldn't, because even as guilt coiled in her chest, something else burned hotter, something reckless, something alive. And when he stepped forward, tilting her chin up with the lightest touch, she realized the truth. It wasn't just the secret that was dangerous. It was how much she wanted to keep it. The weight of their secret loomed over Sophie like a storm cloud, dark and impossible to ignore. Every glance, every accidental brush of hands, every moment spent alone in the house felt like a dangerous gamble. Olivia had always been perceptive, but now, Sophie felt like she was under a microscope, every move analyzed, every breath measured. At dinner, she could barely meet Olivia's eyes, afraid that guilt would be written all over her face. Across the table, Ethan sat calm, his demeanor carefully composed, but Sophie caught the way his fingers tapped lightly against his glass, a subtle, nervous tell. Alette chattered about school while Emma played with her food, completely unaware of the tension tightening the air around the adults. Then, Olivia's voice cut through the room, her tone casual yet sharp. "Sophie, is everything okay? You've been quiet lately." Sophie's stomach clenched. Did she know? Had she noticed something? She forced a smile, gripping the edge of her napkin to keep her hands from trembling. "I'm fine," she lied, her voice steady despite the panic clawing at her chest. But she knew one thing for certain: secrets like this never stayed hidden forever. It was a night Sophie would never forget. The air was thick with tension, the kind that made it hard to breathe. Rain lashed against the windows, the wind howling like a warning neither of them wanted to hear. The house was silent. Olivia was away on another business trip, the children fast asleep upstairs. But Sophie wasn't. She couldn't be, not with Ethan so close. She found him in the dimly lit kitchen, leaning against the counter, a half-finished drink in his hand. His eyes lifted to hers, dark and unreadable. Something had shifted between them, something dangerous, something inevitable. "I can't stop thinking about you," he admitted, his voice raw, stripped of pretense. "And I don't know how to pretend anymore." Sophie's breath caught. This was it. The line they danced around for weeks. The moment where she could walk away, or fall completely. But she didn't move when he reached for her. She didn't stop him when his fingers traced a slow path up her arm, igniting every nerve. And when his lips finally met hers, she knew there was no turning back. This wasn't just a mistake. This was the moment everything would unravel. The days that followed were a blur of stolen moments and suppressed guilt. Every glance, every accidental touch, every whispered conversation in the dimly lit corners of the house carried a dangerous electricity. Sophie felt the weight of their secret pressing against her chest, suffocating and intoxicating all at once. Ethan was everywhere, his voice, his scent, the memory of his hands on her skin. And yet, when Olivia returned from her trip, smiling and kissing her husband on the cheek, Sophie felt something inside her crack. Watching them together, she saw what she had helped break. And for the first time, the reality of it all made her stomach turn. But Ethan didn't waver. If anything, the secrecy fueled him. "I don't regret this," he murmured one evening when he caught her alone, his fingers brushing over hers. His touch was a promise, a temptation, and a curse. Sophie swallowed hard, torn between wanting to run and wanting to drown in him. They were walking a tightrope, knowing that one misstep would send them both crashing down. And yet, she couldn't pull away. Not yet, not when the fire between them still burned so recklessly. Sophie knew it had to end. The weight of their secret had grown too heavy, pressing down on her until every breath felt stolen. Every moment stolen felt like a ticking bomb. She had convinced herself they could control it, that they could keep playing with fire without getting burned. But the flames had spread too far, too fast. One evening, as the house settled into its usual quiet, Ethan found her in the kitchen. "Tell me you don't want this," he said, his voice low, urgent. His fingers hovered near her wrist, hesitant but ready to pull her back in. Sophie clenched her fists, forcing herself to look at him. "I can't," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But that doesn't mean I should." Ethan exhaled, stepping closer, but Sophie shook her head. "I'm leaving," she said, the words tasting like regret, like relief. For the first time, his confidence wavered. "Sophie." "No, Ethan," she cut in, her voice steady now. "If I stay, I lose myself." And with that, she turned and walked away, knowing that if she looked back, she might never leave. Life is full of temptations. But every choice we make carries weight. Emotional entanglements, blurred boundaries, and forbidden desires can be intoxicating, but they often lead to pain and regret. In today's world, where relationships are more complicated than ever, it's crucial to recognize when a situation is pulling you away from your values, your integrity, or your peace of mind. Ask yourself, is this worth the risk? Is this truly love, or just an escape? Sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is walk away, not because you don't care, but because you value yourself enough to choose a path that won't destroy you.